My coworker got a $32,000 retention bonus. I got $4,500. They told me to appreciate the gesture. That night, hackers attacked our systems at 3 in the morning. I did not say a single word. By morning, the landscape of the company had changed forever. I sat in my darkened home office, the blue light of triple monitors reflecting off my glasses. My coffee had gone cold hours ago. The silence of the house felt heavy, a physical weight on my tired shoulders. The Thursday morning meeting played on a loop in my mind. Lisa Roberts had smiled that practiced, corporate smile while discussing our critical value. She spoke about investment and loyalty, as if they were holy sacraments. Then the private emails arrived. I watched the notification pop up like a digital slap. $4,500 for 23 years of keeping the wolves from the door. Jason, who spent his shifts scrolling social media, was suddenly the golden child. I felt the heat of embarrassment rising up my neck. Jason sent the screenshot 10 minutes later. He did not even try to hide his triumph under the guise of surprise. $32,000 in cold, hard cash. He told me the management knew who really mattered around here. I stared at the numbers until they blurred into gray streaks. My daughter's upcoming college tuition bill sat on the corner of my desk, a sharp reminder of why I stayed. I was the stabilizing force of the night shift. Apparently, stability was cheap this year. The monitoring dashboard began to flicker with crimson alerts at midnight. It started as a subtle probe, a digital finger testing the lock on our main vault. I recognized the signature immediately. It was the same group from Eastern Europe that nearly gutted us last Christmas. Back then, I worked 36 hours straight to build a wall they could not climb. This time, the wall was full of holes Jason had accidentally poked while trying to simplify the interface. The attackers found the gap within minutes. By 2 in the morning, the probes turned into a full-scale assault. My phone buzzed incessantly, with automated alerts and panicked messages from Jason. He was finally seeing the red lines on his own screen at home. He asked if I had eyes on the situation. I watched the data packets flying out of our admin layer toward a server in Bucharest. I could have stopped it with 3 lines of code. Instead, I leaned back and watched the cursor blink. The hackers were moving with professional, terrifying speed. I watched the cursor blink. The hackers were moving with professional, terrifying speed. At 3:15, I stood up and reached for the headset cord. Lisa. Voice suddenly crackled through the speakers, sounding thick with sleep and rising panic. She ordered me to fix the breach before the morning trade opened. She promised another small bonus if I stayed on. I did not answer her. I pulled the USB plug and watched the monitors go black. I laid my security badge on the empty desk and walked toward the stairs. Behind me, the server fans whirred in a frantic, losing battle. The cool air of the hallway felt like a phantom limb against my skin. I did not look back at the blue glow fading behind my office door. Upstairs, the house was silent except for the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator. My daughter's room remained dark, her future resting on the thin ice of my bank account. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my hands in the dim moonlight. They were steady. My personal laptop sat on the nightstand, its lid closed like a heavy secret. I opened it and loaded my private financial spreadsheet with practiced precision. The $4,500 looked like a typographical error next to Jason's massive windfall. I typed in the new numbers and watched the software calculate my remaining years of labor. The math was brutal and honest. I was paying for the privilege of being their ghost. My worth was a rounding error. The silence was broken by a sharp vibration from my phone on the mattress. I did not need to see the screen to know it was Jason. He was likely drowning in the technical logs I had spent 2 decades perfecting. The alerts would be screaming across his dashboard like a physical siren. He lacked the intuition to see the pattern behind the chaos. I ignored the call and set the device face down on the wooden table. I began to pull my private documentation from the cloud. These were the notes the company never bothered to ask for during my annual reviews. They were the custom scripts and workarounds that kept the legacy hardware from crashing during peak hours. Without these shortcuts, the entire network functioned at half its promised speed. I realized then that I had been subsidizing their success with my own intellectual property. The realization felt like a cold stone in my stomach. A second call came through, this time from Lisa's personal number. I finally answered, curious to hear the exact pitch of her desperation. Tonight, she did not lead with a greeting or an apology for the earlier call. She told me the main server was beginning to throttle all client traffic. Her voice was thin and brittle like dry autumn leaves. She begged me to sign the retention agreement immediately so she could authorize more pay. I stayed silent. The subtext was clear as she continued to ramble about professional duty and teamwork. She was terrified of the board meeting, scheduled for 9 in the morning. If the system was still red, her career was effectively over by lunchtime. I thought about the used pickup truck her bonus could buy me. It was a meager price for a lifetime of expertise. I told her the agreement was still sitting in my inbox, unsigned and cold. I hung up. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, feeling strangely light. My phone buzzed one last time, with a notification from the corporate emergency channel. The Romanian hackers had finally bypassed the secondary firewall I had built last year. Slept. They were now inside the administrative core, where the real damage happens. Jason was probably staring at a screen he could no longer read. The weight was finally off my shoulders and onto theirs. I went to bed. The sun had not yet risen when my eyes snapped open again. It was only 4 in the morning, but the silence of the house felt artificial and fragile. My phone lay on the floor where it had vibrated itself off the nightstand. The glowing screen showed 47 missed calls and a string of frantic messages. I picked it up and saw the status dashboard through the mobile app. The entire network map was bleeding a deep, pulsating red. I walked back to my office and sat in the dark. I did not turn on the work computer, opting instead for my personal tablet. The attackers were no longer just probing. They had established a persistent presence inside the primary domain controller. This was the crown jewel of our security architecture. If they gained full administrative rights, they could wipe every backup we had. I watched the traffic logs spike with data exfiltration. The company was literally leaking out. A new message popped up from Jason on the internal chat. He was begging for the password to the secondary encryption vault. He claimed Lisa had authorized him to take full control of the recovery process. I knew for a fact he did not have the technical clearance for that specific vault. Giving him the key would be like handing a child a loaded weapon. I watched his cursor hover over the locked file on the shared screen. I realized then that Jason was not just incompetent. He was desperate enough to take dangerous risks. He was trying to run a legacy recovery script that I had deprecated 3 years ago for being unstable. If he executed that command, he would likely corrupt the entire customer database beyond repair. My finger hovered over the keyboard to warn him. But I stopped. My warning was worth exactly $4,500. I decided to let the silence do the talking. The doorbell rang, echoing through the empty hallway like a gunshot. I checked my security camera and saw Paul Anderson, the vice president of operations, standing on my porch. He looked disabled, his expensive suit jacket thrown over a t-shirt. This was a man who had not spoken to me in 5 years. Seeing him at my door, at this hour, was the ultimate admission of defeat. I walked slowly toward the front of the house. I opened the door, and the smell of expensive coffee and sweat hit me. Paul did not waste time with pleasantries or corporate jargon. He told me the board was on a live bridge call, and they were losing millions every hour. He offered to double the retention bonus on the spot if I logged back in. I leaned against the doorframe and looked at his trembling hands. It was the first time I felt like the one in charge. I told Paul that the price of my expertise had gone up significantly since yesterday. He started to argue, mentioning the loyalty I owed the firm after 2 decades. I simply pointed at the red alerts visible on my tablet screen. Just then, a massive notification flashed across the display in bold black letters. The hackers had successfully changed the master administrator password. We were now locked out of our own systems. The company no longer belonged to us. Paul stared at the black screen of my tablet as the gravity of the lockout set in. He looked like a man watching his own house burn from the sidewalk. The master password change was the final nail in the corporate coffin. It meant the hackers now owned the encrypted keys to every financial client we managed. Paul grabbed his phone and began typing a message with shaky fingers. He was likely notifying the board that the nightmare was real. I invited him inside, not out of kindness, but to witness the true cost of his decisions. We walked into my small office where the air was still cold. The single monitor I left on showed the secondary backup server heartbeats. They were flatlining one by one. Paul sank into my guest chair, his face pale under the harsh LED lights. He asked if there was a physical bypass switch in the data center. I just shook my head. The problem was not the hardware, it was the logic. I explained that the attackers had used Jason's unpatched legacy scripts as a bridge to the core. Jason had effectively handed them a skeleton key in exchange for a few hours of convenience. Paul looked sick. He realized the man he had rewarded with $32,000 was the very reason the firm was dying. The irony was a heavy, suffocating presence in the room. It felt like cold justice. My phone chimed with a high-priority email from the company's legal department. They were not asking for help anymore. They were issuing a formal demand for my immediate cooperation. The letter cited a generic emergency clause in my original employment contract from 20 years ago. It threatened litigation if I did not provide my private administrative logs. I laughed out loud, the sound startling Paul. I told him that my contract was for network monitoring, not crisis reconstruction. Paul tried to soften his tone, sensing that threats would not work on a man who had already quit. He mentioned my daughter's future, and how a lawsuit could ruin our lives. It was a low blow, even for a vice president. I showed him the unsigned retention agreement, still sitting in my browser. I told him that the gesture they wanted me to appreciate was what had finally set me free. My loyalty had been bought for far too little. He offered me a blank check, literally reaching for a pen in his pocket. Slept. He said the board would authorize any amount if the system was back online by sunrise. I looked at the clock. It was nearly 5 in the morning. Even with my help, a full restoration would now take days of manual labor. I told him the price was no longer just money. I wanted a signed confession of the security negligence. Paul froze, the pen hovering. Just then, my personal laptop pinged with a notification I had set up months ago. A private recruiter had sent a formal offer letter with a massive salary increase. They had been watching the news of the breach in real time. They knew exactly who was responsible for the stability Apex used to have. The industry was already moving on from my old firm. I looked at Paul and realized I did not need his blank check anymore. The bridge was gone. The recruiter's offer glowed on my secondary screen, a beacon of solid, logical reality. Paul saw the light shift on my face and leaned forward, his eyes searching for a crack. He did not know about the new offer yet. He still thought money was the only tether keeping me from walking out that front door. I closed the laptop lid with a soft click. The sound echoed in the quiet room like a gavel. The negotiation was over. Paul's phone rang again, the vibration rattling against my wooden desk. He ignored it at first, but the persistent buzzing forced his hand. He looked at the caller ID, and his expression went from desperate to terrified. It was the CEO. Paul stepped into the hallway to take the call, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. I could hear snippets of his lies through the thin drywall. He was blaming the outage on a hardware failure. I stood up and walked to the window, watching the first hints of dawn touch the trees. The world was waking up to a massive financial crisis that I had stopped preventing. It felt strange to be the spectator instead of the shield. For 23 years, my internal clock had been synced to the server heartbeats. Now, I was finally on my own time. I realized I did not miss the adrenaline. I only missed the respect. Paul returned to the office, his face a ghostly shade of gray. The CEO had given him a direct ultimatum. Either the systems were back by 6 in the morning, or the firm would initiate a forensic audit. An audit would expose everything. It would show the bonus disparity and the negligence of the day's shift. Paul looked at me and practically fell to his knees. He begged me to help him cover the trail of logs. I looked at him with a detachment that surprised me. He was asking me to commit a crime to save his career. I reminded him that I was no longer an employee of Apex Security. Any work I did now would be as an independent consultant with a massive hourly rate. I pulled a fresh sheet of paper from my printer. I began to draft a contract that favored me in every single clause. Paul watched the pen move. The terms were simple and non-negotiable. I wanted the full $32,000 immediately plus a signed release from all liability. Paul read the paper twice, his breathing heavy and uneven. He knew he was signing his own professional death warrant. If he agreed, the board would eventually find out he paid a resigned employee to fix his mess. He had no other choice. The clock on the wall struck 5:30. He reached for the pen. As the ink dried on the paper, my tablet chimed with a final, devastating alert. The Romanian hackers had not just locked us out, they had initiated a full wipe of the primary customer database. The screen showed a countdown timer, with only 15 minutes remaining. Paul looked at the timer and then at me, his eyes wide with horror. Even with the contract signed, I realized the data might already be gone. The stakes had just tripled. The countdown timer on the tablet screen pulsed a toxic neon green against the dark wood of my desk. 15 minutes remained before the purge command finalized and wiped 20 years of client trust into nothingness. Paul's breathing was a ragged, wet sound in the silence of the room. He stared at the ticking numbers, as if he could stop them by sheer force of will. I picked up my phone and opened the terminal interface. My hands were perfectly still. The air felt electric. I did not move to save the data immediately. Instead, I looked at the signed contract sitting between us on the desk. Paul had agreed to the $32,000. But the money was still just a promise on paper. I told him I needed the transfer initiated before I touched a single key. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. It was a look I had earned through 2 decades of being ignored. He pulled out his banking app. The clock hit 12. The vibration of my personal phone signaled the arrival of the funds. I checked the balance and saw the full amount cleared into my savings. It was finally done. I turned to the keyboard and began the counter intrusion process. My fingers moved with a muscle memory that bypassed conscious thought. I bypassed the main admin lockout using a backdoor I had hidden in the kernel 5 years ago. I was finally back inside my own kingdom. The timer slowed down. I intercepted the wipe command at the 7-minute mark. The hackers realized someone competent was finally fighting back and began to flood the port with junk data. It was a classic distraction technique designed to mask a secondary attack. I ignored the noise and focused on the core database directory. I began to shift the master keys to an offline vault Paul could not access. I felt the surge of power that comes with total control. The data was safe. The attackers retreated suddenly, leaving a final message on the terminal screen in broken English. They thanked me for the challenge and vanished into the dark web. I leaned back and exhaled a long breath I had been holding since midnight. The network map slowly transitioned from a bleeding red back to a stable, calm green. Paul slumped in his chair, his face buried in his hands. He looked like a man who had survived a plane crash. We sat. The silence was broken by the sound of my daughter's footsteps on the stairs. She walked in the kitchen, oblivious to the corporate warfare that had just concluded in the next room. She asked if I was coming to breakfast before her early shift at the library. I told her I would be there in a moment. Paul looked up, his eyes bloodshot and weary. He realized my world was still intact while his was about to face an audit. Paul asked if I would stay on to help him explain the breach to the CEO during the morning bridge. I looked at him and felt a sudden, sharp wave of pity. He truly believed he could still spin this disaster into a manageable narrative. I reminded him that our contract ended the moment the data was secured. I was no longer an employee or even a consultant. I was just a man with a very healthy bank account. I stood up. I walked Paul to the front door and watched the sunrise finally break over the neighborhood. The sky was a pale, watery blue. He paused on the porch and asked what he should tell Lisa when she called for the status update. I told him to tell her the truth for once in her life. Tell her that expertise has a market price and they refuse to pay it. He didn't respond. He just walked to his car and drove away. I returned to my office and deleted every trace of my presence from the corporate network. I removed the backdoors, the custom scripts, and the hidden logs that had saved them tonight. The system was now exactly as Jason and Lisa had designed it. It was a hollow shell of security waiting for the next sophisticated predator to find the cracks. I felt no guilt about leaving it that way. I had been paid to fix it once. Not forever. I sat down at the kitchen table, watching the sunlight play across the wood. My daughter looked happy and hopeful about her upcoming semester. The $32,000 would cover everything she needed and more. I realized the greatest victory was not the money or the revenge. It was the simple fact that I did not have to go back. My phone buzzed with a message from Jason. I blocked his number and took a long sip. The quiet house felt like a sanctuary for the first time in years. I returned to my office and saw a final notification on the personal tablet. It was an automated system log, showing the aftermath of the cleanup. The corporate servers were purging the temporary credentials I used. Everything was returning to a state of equilibrium. I realized I had left a ghost in their machine. I pulled my personal hard drive from the workstation and packed it into a padded case. It contained 20 years of knowledge that Apex Security no longer owned. This data was my leverage and my legacy. My hands felt light as I disconnected the high-speed Ethernet cables from my secondary laptop. The room seemed smaller without the constant hum of the server fans. I was finally disassembling the cage I built for myself. I felt a sudden sense of profound relief. A notification chime broke my focus. It was an email from the lead recruiter at the Austin firm. They wanted to schedule a final meeting with the chief technology officer at noon. The subject line mentioned a signing bonus that exceeded my previous annual salary. My worth was being measured by people who actually understood the complexity of the Romanian breach. It was a sharp contrast to Lisa's dismissive attitude. The industry was already correcting the mistakes of my former employer. I checked the news feeds one last time before logging off. The financial markets were opening with reports of technical glitches at several major banks. Apex Security was not mentioned by name yet, but the ripples were growing. I knew it was only a matter of hours before the forensic teams started asking questions. They would find the gaps Jason left behind. They would see the unsigned retention agreement in the logs. My trail was clean, but theirs was a disaster. The phone rang an unknown number from a local area code. I hesitated but eventually answered, expecting another desperate plea from the office. Instead, it was a techan I had trained 5 years ago. He was calling from the data center floor in a state of total panic. He told me the core cooling system was failing because of an automated routine. He did not know how to override the manual lockout. I listened to his heavy, rapid breathing. I realized Lisa had authorized a system-wide reset to hide the evidence of the earlier breach. In her haste to protect her career, she was physically destroying the server racks. The cooling failure was a direct result of her ignorance regarding the hardware dependencies. I could have explained the bypass in 10 seconds. I could have saved the hardware from a catastrophic thermal event. Instead, I remembered the cold smile she gave me during the bonus meeting. I stayed silent. The technician begged me for the override code, mentioning the potential for a fire. I told him to pull the manual emergency breakers and evacuate the floor immediately. It was the only safe option left for the human beings in that building. I would not help them save the machines that had enslaved my time. He sounded terrified as he realized I was not coming to the rescue. I ended the call and deleted the contact. The bridges were all burning now. I spent the next hour drafting my formal resignation letter for the Human Resources portal. Slept. I kept the language neutral and professional to avoid any legal entanglements. I cited a misalignment of compensation and scope as the primary reason for my departure. There was no mention of the hack or the bonus disparity. The facts would for themselves during the upcoming litigation. I hit the send button and closed the browser tab. The connection was finally severed. My daughter sent a text asking if I wanted to grab dinner to celebrate my new job. I smiled and started typing a reply about a steakhouse downtown. Just then, a black sedan pulled into my driveway. I recognized the car from the executive parking lot at work. It was the company's head of security, a man known for his ruthless efficiency. He did not get out of the car immediately. He just sat there, watching my front door. I realized then that the forensic audit had started much faster than I anticipated. They were not here to negotiate. Slept. They were here to recover the private documentation I had removed. The head of security was likely looking for any grounds to claim intellectual property theft, knowing my departure coincided with the erasure of their primary archives. I gripped the padded case containing my hard drive and felt the adrenaline return. This was no longer just about a bonus or a hack. It was a fight for my freedom. I waited. The sedan door opened with a heavy, metallic thud. Marcus, the head of security, stepped out and adjusted his suit. He did not look like a man coming for a fight. He looked like a man coming for a chore. I walked onto the porch, clutching the padded hard drive case. We stood in the morning light for a long minute. He asked if I had anything that belonged to the firm. I told him my mind was the only thing I had kept. Marcus sighed and leaned against his car. He told me the server room was a total loss. The thermal event had fused the storage arrays into slag. Lisa had tried to blame the physical failure on me, but the logs told a different story. They showed her manual override command clearly. She had bypassed the cooling safety protocols herself. The board was already moving to terminate her for cause. Marcus looked tired. He knew I held the only viable backups in the city, because the remote replication had failed during the server room meltdown. I realized then that his presence was not a threat, but a final, desperate purchase order. He admitted that the company's survival depended on the data I had in my hand. He offered a massive settlement to return the drives and sign a non-disclosure agreement. I looked at the hard drive case and then at the road. For years, I had believed that my value was tied to my loyalty. Now, I saw that my value was tied to my exit. I told Marcus that the data was no longer for sale. I had already wiped the drives 15 minutes before he arrived. His face went completely slack as he realized the implication. The legacy scripts, the custom fixes, and the customer archives were gone forever. There was nothing left to recover from the slag in the data center. I was finally clean of the corruption that had defined my life. He asked why I would destroy such a valuable asset. I told him that some things are worth more than a settlement check. The look of realization on his face was better than any bonus. He got back into his sedan without another word. I watched him drive away, the exhaust fading into the Austin heat. My phone buzzed with the final confirmation for my new job. I was officially a senior architect at a firm that valued peace over panic. The ghost of the machine was finally at rest. I went back inside and saw a photo of my daughter on the mantel. Her tuition was paid in full, and my retirement was secure. I had turned their low valuation into my greatest leverage. The lie that hard work was enough had finally been replaced by the truth of self-worth. I sat on my sofa and closed my eyes as the house grew quiet. For the first time in 23 years, I was not waiting for an alarm to go off.